"Get away from that van. I've already called the cops and they're on their way." The woman's voice cracked through the quiet morning like a whip, shrill and insistent. The paramedic barely flinched. Her hands were deep inside the mobile ITU, fingers dancing over the chest of an unconscious man as a high-frequency beeping threatened to flatline. Behind her, another medic adjusted the defibrillator. Time was bleeding out faster than the man on the gurney. The woman in the robe and slippers, arms crossed with righteous fury, had no clue that the so-called suspicious vehicle parked in front of her neighbor's house wasn't here to steal. It was here to save, and the man dying inside, her own husband. It had all started an hour earlier when a private emergency medical alert pinged through a satellite linked to an elite medical response van stationed just outside city limits. The team inside wasn't ordinary. They were part of a new government-backed trial. A roving ICU unit equipped with cutting-edge tech and a team trained to handle situations where seconds mattered more than addresses. They didn't wait for traffic lights. They didn't wait for permission. When Michael Edwards' vitals spiked erratically during his morning coffee, the alert had gone out through a wearable monitor sensed to the van. His daughter, who lived out of town but monitored his health remotely, had triggered the call-in with a trembling finger. That van tore through traffic like a missile. They made it in 5 minutes. What they hadn't planned for was the local AFOL committee head standing in the way, waving her phone like a weapon and squawking about suspicious activity. Samantha, the lead paramedic, wasn't new to drama. She'd seen worse in war zones, but even she couldn't believe this woman was seriously trying to block access to an active medical emergency. The back of the van was open, revealing blinking monitors, oxygen tanks, 4 bags already dripping. The patient was strapped in, eyes fluttering, a patch on his chest reading, "Michael E." Samantha had already begun intubation. Her partner David was prepping a mobile AED in case his heart dipped again. None of that mattered to Karen. Yes, her real name, who stood in her driveway next door, blocking the street with her arms stretched like she was forming a human roadblock. "This is a private neighborhood," she snapped. "You can't just park here. I saw your van circling twice. That's casing behavior. We have rules." "We're in the middle of a medical emergency," Samantha said flatly, not even pausing in her work. "This man is going into cardiac arrest." "Move," Karen scoffed. "Medical emergency? Right. I've seen those scam vans on TikTok. You're just looking for someone to rob. What kind of ambulance doesn't even have flashing lights?" "The kind that's focused on saving lives, not putting on a show," David muttered as he adjusted the oxygen flow. "I'm warning you," Karen shouted. "The police are coming. You just delayed a 911 call to stop us from saving someone's life," Samantha snapped, her voice finally rising with fury. "And you're calling us criminals." But Karen was already back on her phone, whispering fast into it. Yes, it's here now. Big black van, no plates, definitely suspicious. There's someone inside, and I think they're being kidnapped. No, I'm not making this up. I'm the neighborhood watch lead." Samantha looked down at Michael, whose lips were now visibly blue. His pulse was thready and fading. There was no time for debate. She reached for the defibrillator pads, stripped back his shirt, and placed them on his chest. Clear. The shock jolted Michael's body upward. The flatline buzz jumped, then sputtered back into erratic blips. A rhythm. Not good, but not dead. David let out a slow breath. "We're losing time," he said. Then came the sirens. The sound approached like Judgment Day. 2 black and white cruisers screeched into the cul-de-sac and slammed to a halt behind the van. Officers jumped out, guns drawn, shouting commands. Samantha stepped into the open, hands raised, palms bloodied. "We're medics. Emergency response. This man is in cardiac arrest. Back away from the vehicle." An officer barked, aiming his weapon. David emerged from the van slowly, both hands up. Karen stood behind them with her arms folded, nodding with smug satisfaction like she had single-handedly stopped a bank heist. "See? I told you. Criminals." One officer made it to the van's back doors and pulled them wide open, and froze. His eyes scanned the interior. A full-size heart monitor blipping. Medical gear in mid-use. an oxygen line pumping into the mouth of an elderly man lying lifeless on a stretcher. That's Michael Edwards, the cop said slowly, recognizing the man on the gurney. He's my dad's fishing buddy. What? Karen blurted, face suddenly pale. No, that can't be. David jumped into action. He's crashing again. Clear. Another shock. Another jolt. The rhythm held. I want everyone out of the way unless you're helping, Samantha snapped to the stunned cops. He needs hospital backup now. You wasted 5 precious minutes. The officers began holstering their weapons and shouting into radios, calling for an escort to the ER. Karen tried to slip backward toward her porch, pretending she hadn't just tried to get paramedics arrested. Don't even think about it, Samantha said without turning. We'll be filing an obstruction report, and when his daughter finds out you stalled us, good luck walking that back. Karen's mouth opened, but no words came out. As the van was loaded up to move, Samantha sat beside Michael, monitoring the vitals and manually compressing a bag valve. Her expression was hard, her eyes locked on the blips. The van rolled away with police lights clearing the path this time. No sirens, just silence and tension. Karen stood in her robe and slippers, alone now in the street. She glanced once at her reflection in a passing car's window and for the first time in a long time, didn't like the person looking back. Inside the van, Michael's vitals ticked just enough for hope to remain, and outside, the damage Karen had done was only beginning to unravel. Samantha didn't speak a word during the high-speed escort to the hospital. Her eyes were glued to the monitor while her fingers tapped quick commands into the touchscreen beside it, adjusting medication doses in real time. Michael's heartbeat was jagged and irregular, dipping into dangerous bradycardia every few minutes before clawing its way back to life. The mobile ITU was state-of-the-art, but there were limits, and they were nearing them. David kept glancing between the road ahead and the oxygen tank levels, silently cursing under his breath every time they hit a pothole that jostled the patient. Outside, the police cruisers cleared intersections, sirens howling, parting traffic like water. Inside the van, it felt like they were trying to keep a candle from flickering out in a hurricane. At one point, Michael's chest stuttered, his breathing shallow and almost non-existent. Samantha grabbed the crash bag, repositioned his airway, and administered another dose through the IV line. She didn't even bother asking for help. David knew the rhythm of her work. They trained together, deployed together, and now operated like synchronized machines. Still, there was one variable they could never plan for, and that was people like Karen. When they arrived at the ER, hospital staff were already waiting, alerted by the mobile ITU's real-time sync with the trauma center's network. The moment the van doors opened, a team descended like clockwork, transferring Michael onto a hospital gurney while Samantha rattled off vitals, medications, history, and timestamps. As the automatic doors swung open to swallow the chaos, David let out a long breath for the first time in over 30 minutes. Samantha stayed behind, eyes locked on the entrance, until the last wheel of the gurney disappeared inside. Then she turned toward the nearest nurse and said, "You'll want to put a note in the file. Police intervention delayed response time by 7 minutes. A neighbor called it in as a kidnapping." The nurse blinked. "What?" "Karen," David muttered with a sigh. "There's always a Karen." Inside the hospital, Michael was rushed into triage, and a rapid team of specialists began working on him. He flatlined again midway through the hallway, forcing doctors to crack open the crash cart and restart his heart for the 3rd time that morning. The lead physician, a seasoned trauma doctor named Dr. Rivera, grimaced as he worked. "He shouldn't even be alive right now," he murmured. "Whatever you two did in that van, you bought him just enough time." But the tension didn't end there. Outside in the waiting room, Karen arrived 10 minutes later, out of breath and red-faced, not from guilt, but from the indignation of being locked out of the process. She marched up to the front desk and slammed her palm down. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge. I am Michael Edwards' wife, and I've been completely left in the dark. I have rights." The receptionist didn't flinch. "Ma'am, the patient is in critical condition. No visitors right now. Please take a seat." I want a list of everyone who touched him, Karen snapped. That van. They didn't have proper markings. I still think this whole thing is shady. I want names, departments, certifications. Man, the receptionist said, cutting her off sharply, that shady van just saved your husband's life. Karen stood there blinking rapidly, face twitching with confusion and anger, as if the words didn't compute. But I didn't know it was him in the van. You made a false report during a medical emergency, the receptionist continued coldly, and it nearly killed him. The paramedics had to stop CPR to put their hands up for the police. You want someone to blame. Start with a mirror. Karen looked around. Several people in the waiting room were watching her now, their expressions varying from disgust to disbelief. She muttered something unintelligible and slunk into a corner chair, crossing her arms and stewing in silence. In another wing of the hospital, Samantha stood with Dr. Rivera in the observation room overlooking the ITU bay. Michael was stable for now. Tubes ran from his arms, his mouth, and his chest. Machines kept him alive. Dr. Rivera crossed his arms and turned to Samantha. How long until full trauma response teams are on wheels like yours? Not soon enough, Samantha said, but we're pushing the limits. Today was the first time the program got real-world stress tested in a suburban zone. You passed, but it nearly cost us the patient. It wasn't the medicine that nearly cost him. It was ignorance. Dr. Rivera didn't argue. Downstairs, Karen tried to regain control of the narrative. She stood again, pulling out her phone and dialing Michael's daughter, Rebecca. Sweetheart, I didn't know what was happening. And there was this creepy van. Rebecca's voice sliced through the speaker. Karen, shut up. I got the alert call. I watched the GPS feed. I saw your name on the police report. You called the cops on the only people saving Dad's life. But I thought. You didn't think. And if Dad doesn't make it, you're never stepping into my life again. Don't even come to the funeral. The line went dead. Karen stared at her phone like it had betrayed her. Across the room, someone was recording her with their own phone, though they quickly looked away when she caught their eye. It didn't matter. She could feel the shift in the air around her. Something irreversible had just happened, and no HOA badge or neighborhood gossip circle was going to fix it. Back in the van, Samantha began cleaning equipment and logging trauma data. David handed her a protein bar without a word. They sat in silence for a moment before Samantha spoke. If he dies, he won't, David said. He's a stubborn old guy. You can tell. Samantha nodded, but the fire in her eyes hadn't cooled. You ever have someone point a gun at you while you're holding a syringe? Not since Afghanistan. They shared a look. Then David grinned weakly. If we ever make a commercial for the program, I'm putting this day in bold print. Samantha chuckled, but it was hollow. You know what's worse than getting shot at in a war zone? What? Getting interrupted by a woman in pink slippers and curlers who thinks her HOA bylaws override a cardiac arrest. Outside, the van engine purred to life again. They weren't done, not even close. There were reports to file, follow-ups to conduct, and a trail of chaos left by Karen's blind righteousness that someone was going to have to clean up. And knowing Samantha, she'd make sure Karen remembered every second of it. The hallway outside Michael's ICU room was filled with a tense, electric quiet, the kind that only happens when a life hangs delicately between this world and the next. Machines hissed and beeped behind the closed glass door, each sound acting like a metronome for Samantha's pulse. She stood with her arms folded, a clipboard tucked under one elbow, watching through the glass as the hospital's trauma team monitored Michael's vitals. His face was pale and sunken, wires crawling across his body like vines in a tangle of critical care. But he was alive for now, and that was more than anyone had expected given the chaos they just pushed through. David leaned against the opposite wall, sipping weak coffee from a styrofoam cup. He looked over at Samantha and said, "Do you think she even realizes what she almost caused? If she had waited 10 more seconds to call, or blocked us any longer, we'd be standing in that room filling out a death report instead of a recovery log," Samantha replied. "So no, I don't think she has a damn clue." Karen hadn't made another scene since her daughter-in-law's brutal call shut her down in the waiting room, but her damage lingered. Her actions had caused a 7-minute delay, a weapons-drawn standoff, and a possible inquiry into the ICU program itself. Samantha knew how delicate the pilot program was. Any bad press, especially involving law enforcement, could slow or even shut it down. They were walking a tightrope, balancing innovation with public perception, and Karen had nearly snapped the wire with one phone call. As Samantha flipped open her notes to start writing her incident report, a nurse approached with an update. Vitals are stabilizing. He's responding to touch. No speech yet, but it looks like the worst is behind him. You guys bought him just enough time. Samantha exhaled for what felt like the first time in hours. Thanks. Let me know if anything changes. The nurse nodded and turned, but paused. By the way, he's trying to say something. Keeps trying to lift his arm. We had to restrain it lightly. He keeps reaching for his chest. Samantha's brow furrowed. She walked over to the ICU room and stepped inside, careful to stay out of the team's way. She crouched beside the bed and gently placed her hand on Michael's. His fingers twitched, and his eyelids fluttered open slightly. "Mr. Edwards," she said softly, "you're at County General. You had a cardiac arrest, but you made it." His mouth moved faintly, barely a whisper. Samantha leaned in, trying to catch it. It sounded like a name. She leaned closer. "Karen," he rasped. Samantha blinked in surprise. "You want to see your wife." He gave the weakest shake of his head she'd ever seen. "No," he whispered. She blocked. The van, even sedated and semi-conscious, he knew. Somehow he had registered what had happened. The delay, the argument, maybe even her voice screaming outside the mobile ICU. Samantha looked at the nurse and nodded grimly. He knows. Back outside, Karen hadn't moved far from her seat in the waiting room. Her phone was now tucked in her bag, and she stared blankly at the fish tank on the wall, watching neon Tetris swim in dizzying loops. She flinched when Samantha walked up. "Your husband's alive," Samantha said plainly, "and he knows what you did." Karen looked up, her expression a mix of relief and wounded pride. "I didn't know it was him in there." "I thought you were. You thought we were criminals because our van wasn't flashy enough. You thought your judgment call was more important than a man's heartbeat. You thought a lot of things, and none of them were right." "I panicked," Karen hissed, lowering her voice. "There's been break-ins lately. The neighborhood's been on edge." "That's not an excuse," Samantha snapped. "You made a choice based on fear, not fact. And that nearly cost a man, your husband, his life." Karen's eyes welled up. "But he's okay now, right?" Samantha stared at her, unimpressed. "He flatlined twice. Once in your driveway and once again in the hospital hallway. We brought him back. But let me be clear. Your call almost stopped that from happening. If you had succeeded, he'd be in a morgue right now." Karen shrank into her seat, visibly shaking now. "What do I even say to him?" "Nothing. For once, maybe just listen." Samantha turned and walked away, tired of repeating what should have been obvious. Back in the ICU corridor, David waved her over. "You're not going to believe this," he said, holding out his phone. On the screen was a local news alert. Neighborhood HOA leader calls police on mobile ITU. Husband was inside being resuscitated. The story had already gone viral. Someone, probably a neighbor or a witness, had filmed the whole thing from across the street. The footage showed Karen blocking the driveway, screaming into her phone, then arguing with police as they approached with weapons drawn. The moment the officer recognized Michael on the stretcher and dropped his stance was being replayed in slow motion across social media platforms. Comments were savage. "Karen strikes again. Neighborhood watch or neighborhood wrecker. Imagine dying because your own wife thinks she's smarter than a medic." Samantha scrolled through the flood of comments, some funny, some furious, all unanimous in their judgment. David smirked. "Looks like the court of public opinion's already delivered a verdict." "She's lucky we're not filing obstruction charges," Samantha muttered, "but I wouldn't be surprised if Rebecca does." As if on cue, Rebecca arrived at the hospital, her face etched with stress, but her steps quick and deliberate. She met Samantha and David outside the ICU and immediately wrapped Samantha in a hug. "Thank you," she whispered. "They told me you were with him the whole way. I don't even know how to repay you." "You already did," Samantha said. "You hired us before anyone else thought it mattered. That made all the difference." Rebecca nodded, but her expression darkened. "And my stepmother, waiting outside. The nurses kept her away." "Good," Rebecca said, her voice turning to ice. "If my dad ever wakes up fully and asks for her, I'll remind him she chose rules over resuscitation." Samantha didn't argue. They all knew the truth now. Karen's reputation wasn't just a neighborhood joke anymore. It was a public disgrace with viral traction. And the worst part, she still didn't understand what she'd done. As the monitors behind the ICU door hummed steadily, Samantha made a mental note to document everything. Not just for the hospital, not even for the program's records, but in case this ever went to court. Because next time a Karen tried to block an emergency vehicle, she wanted this story ready to be Exhibit A. And judging by how fast the internet was spreading it, the world was already paying attention. 3 days after the incident, the neighborhood that once proudly displayed HOA Karen for Community First flyers now quietly peeled them off their notice board. The local news story hadn't just gone viral. It had exploded. With over 2 million views in 72 hours, the footage of Karen screaming about a kidnapping van while her husband flatlined inside had become a case study in public overreach and tragic irony. National outlets picked it up, calling it a cautionary tale about how paranoia and entitlement could cost lives. The internet had dubbed her CPR Karen, and not even the HOA board could keep a lid on the backlash. One neighbor wrote an open letter titled "When Rules Kill," and it was pinned to the community bulletin board next to a petition for Karen's removal from the board. It had 47 signatures in less than a day. Out of 52 homes, that was damning. Samantha didn't care much for internet drama, but even she had to admit the wave of support was validating. The comments pouring into her team's inbox were a mixture of praise, gratitude, and disbelief that someone could be so aggressively ignorant. The video had even caught the attention of several emergency medical associations, with one California trauma surgeon reposting it with a single-word caption: "Unreal." The timing couldn't have been better. The ICU on Wheels program had just reached a critical review stage in its pilot phase, and the public attention was now tilting things favorably. Still, none of that erased the chaos they'd gone through to earn it. At County General, Michael remained in stable condition, but not yet able to speak fully. His daughter Rebecca stayed at his side most hours, watching over him and fielding reporters who were now camped outside the hospital. Hospital security had turned away 3 different news vans trying to sneak in for a photo of the man whose life was almost ended by a 911 call gone wrong. Rebecca declined all interviews, but she didn't stop others from speaking. She knew the more people saw what her stepmother had done, the more likely it was that programs like the ICU van would get the backing they needed. On the 4th day, a local news station held a press event at the hospital, organized by the county's Emergency Services Board. The reporters expected a suit-and-tie bureaucrat to talk in careful, measured tones. What they got instead was Samantha. She stood in front of a dozen microphones, her dark uniform speckled with faint wear marks from countless emergencies. Behind her stood David, several nurses, and even the trauma doctor, Dr. Rivera. A large screen to the side played a silent loop of the van's approach, the confrontation, and the police reaction, muted but unmistakable. "I'm not here to point fingers," Samantha began, her voice calm but steely. "But I am here to say that what happened last week was not just a misunderstanding. It was a moment where fear tried to shout louder than fact, where assumptions overrode empathy, and where a man nearly died because someone thought their personal suspicions mattered more than our medical protocols." The crowd was silent. Even the reporters didn't fidget. "Our team was summoned because we are trained to respond to critical medical alerts faster than traditional ambulances. This van isn't a substitute. It's a supplement, a lifeline, and we don't have time to debate every driveway we park in. When someone's heart has stopped, we respond. We save. That's our job." A reporter raised a hand. "What would you say to someone who argues you were unmarked and that it was reasonable to be suspicious?" Samantha didn't hesitate. I'd say if you see a team performing CPR, hooked to oxygen tanks and cardiac monitors, maybe ask a question before calling the police. Maybe pause and wonder if that person lying there is someone you know, someone you love, because that's exactly what happened. And yes, we were unmarked, but so are most tragedies before they hit the news. Another hand went up. Have you spoken to the woman who made the call? No, Samantha replied flatly. She hasn't reached out, but she tried to speak to my supervisor, claimed she was concerned for community safety. I told him to let her know that next time she has a concern, she can bring cookies, not cops. The room let out a small ripple of laughter, but behind the humor, there was a tightrope of fury Samantha walked with precision. She didn't want vengeance. She wanted change. After the event, the clip of her speech made its rounds. It was retweeted by medical professionals, shared on emergency responder forums, and even picked up by a late-night host who played the brain cookies, not cops line with a booming laugh. Karen, meanwhile, remained completely silent. No statements, no apologies, no appearances. Her home looked shuttered from the outside, blinds drawn tight, curtains shut. Neighbors whispered she was too embarrassed to show her face. A few said she tried to resign from the HOA, but the board insisted on a formal vote. They wanted to make it public. Rebecca visited Samantha the next day, bringing coffee and a letter. "From my dad," she explained, smiling. "He still can't speak much, but he asked the nurses to help him write something." Samantha opened the note and read slowly, "Thank you for not stopping. Even when the world tried to." There wasn't a signature, just a shaky underline and a date. Samantha folded the paper and tucked it into her vest pocket. "That means more than any award they could give us." Rebecca nodded. "He wants to talk to her, not because he forgives her, but because he wants her to understand what she almost cost him. You think she'll listen?" "I think this time she won't have a choice." 2 days later, the board held its HOA meeting in the community clubhouse. For the first time in years, every chair was filled. Even people who normally skip these events came out. Karen sat at the front table, shoulders stiff, jaw clenched. As the petition signatures were read aloud, she didn't interrupt. When they asked if she had a final statement, she stood but said nothing, just walked out without a word. The door closed behind her like a final chapter, and 2 blocks away, the mobile ICU van pulled quietly into the Edwards driveway. This time invited, Michael was coming home. The neighbors watched from their porches. Some waved, some clapped. One left a small sign on the lawn that read, "Welcome home, Michael. We've got your back." Unlike some people, Karen never responded to the sign. She never would. The morning Michael came home, the air in the neighborhood felt different, less like a street full of manicured lawns and passive-aggressive flyers, and more like a community holding its breath. The mobile ICU van glided into the driveway again, this time met with curious eyes, cautious respect, and something that hadn't been there before, gratitude. Neighbors who had stayed silent during the fallout now stepped outside, nodding or offering small waves as the van's back doors opened and the stretcher emerged. Michael was awake, alert, and propped up with a soft neck pillow, a thin smile on his face that hinted at more strength than he probably had. He still had wires taped under his shirt, and a portable monitor beeped gently by his side, but he was alive and back where he belonged. Samantha was the one steering the gurney. David walked beside her, carrying Michael's medication bag and a clipboard with discharge instructions. It wasn't standard protocol for the ICU team to make home drop-offs, but Rebecca had asked, and Samantha had agreed without hesitation. After everything, she wanted to be the one to wheel Michael into the house he nearly never returned to. It felt right. As they guided the stretcher up the temporary ramp installed over the porch steps, Michael's hand twitched, gesturing weakly toward the neighborhood. "More people than I expected," he said, his voice still gravelly but steady. Samantha smiled. Words fast, especially when it involves ambulances, defibrillators, and a YouTube clip with 3 million views. Michael chuckled, then winced. "Still hurts when I laugh, which is annoying because everything about this is absurd." They rolled him into the living room where Rebecca had set up a temporary recovery area. Medical bed, oxygen tank, clean sheets, a table stacked with cards from friends and strangers alike. One had a crayon drawing from a kid 3 houses down that read, "Sorry your heart got mad. Feel better, Mr. Michael." He reached out and picked it up with trembling fingers. "This is what matters." Samantha gave him a nod. "This is why we do what we do." Rebecca ushered them toward the kitchen for coffee while a nurse from the recovery team got Michael settled. The house was spotless, smells of lemon disinfectant still lingering in the air. On the fridge were a dozen printouts, emails from strangers, a screen grab of Samantha's speech, a news article titled "The Van That Saved a Life and Shamed a Neighborhood." One headline from a satire site read, "Woman Calls Cops on Husband's CPR. Claims EMTs were acting suspiciously alive." Over coffee, Rebecca finally brought up what Samantha had wondered about all week. "She wants to talk to him," Rebecca said quietly. "Karen, she called this morning. Said she didn't want to come here, but she wanted to say something. I told her she could show up in person or not at all." Samantha set her cup down. "You think he wants that?" "I think he wants it finished, on his terms." An hour later, the knock came. Karen stood on the porch holding a small bag with a plastic container inside. Cookies, probably. She looked smaller than she had all those days ago, not in size, but in energy. Her hair wasn't done. Her face looked hollow, and her eyes never quite met Rebecca's when the door opened. "He's in the living room," Rebecca said simply, stepping aside. Karen walked in like a trespasser, her shoulders tight, her feet slow. When she saw Michael, she stopped short. He was half upright in the medical bed, one arm resting on a folded towel. His eyes were open, calm, but unreadable. "I brought you these," Karen said, holding out the bag. Michael didn't reach for it. "Why?" Karen hesitated. "Because I'm sorry. I didn't know it was you. I didn't think. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood. I thought the van was dangerous. I panicked." Michael was quiet for a long time. The monitor beside him beeped steadily, a soft reminder of how easily that sound could have gone silent. "Do you know what it felt like?" he asked finally, voice low. "To hear your voice screaming outside, when I was flat on my back, unable to breathe. I heard you yelling about criminals, about rules, and I thought, she'll never let them help me." Karen's lips trembled. "I didn't mean. I know exactly what you meant," he interrupted. "You meant that your suspicion was more important than logic, that your fear was more urgent than my life. You didn't ask questions. You didn't wait. You acted, and it nearly ended me." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I didn't know. I thought I was doing the right thing." Michael closed his eyes. "So did they. The difference is their right thing saved me." Karen looked at the floor, silent. Then she slowly placed the bag on the side table and turned to leave. Before she reached the door, Michael spoke again. "You want to make it right." She turned, hope flickering. "Step down from the HOA and volunteer at the hospital, not on a board, at a desk. In scrubs and silence. Learn what it means to help without control." Karen nodded slowly. For the first time in days, her voice was steady. "Okay." She left without another word. Later that evening, Samantha and David sat outside the van, parked across the street, just watching the house. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the lawn. David leaned back against the door, arms folded. "You think she meant it?" "I think she's shaken enough to at least try," Samantha said. "And if not, well, she's already infamous. The internet doesn't forget." They sat in silence for a while, letting the day settle. "You know what the best part is?" David asked. "What?" "This van. It's not leaving. The city just approved the pilot for full integration. We're staying." Samantha smiled, eyes on the Edwards house. "Good. Maybe this neighborhood needs a reminder." Parked right in front of them. David raised an eyebrow. "So what's next?" Samantha shrugged. "Same thing as always. Answer the call. Ignore the noise, and hope the next Karen stays in her lane." As the porch light flicked on and Michael's laughter faintly echoed through the night air, the van purred to life, ready for its next mission. Because not all heroes wear capes. Some drive unmarked vans.